Galileo and the Camera, in which is shown that the sensor of a digital camera has a large repertoire of possible states, perhaps larger than Galileo's. To make progress, one may need to step back, thought Galileo, look over one's shoulder and not take things for granted. Consciousness we take for granted, he thought, because we always had it, and it requires no effort. We see dark, we see light, we see a woman, we see any of a trillion things. They are just there, she is just there, immediately there, with no need for us to seek, compare or calculate. And yet, that immediacy may be illusory, and yet she may appear to us only because we are inordinately rich, because our brain can pick and choose from an inexhaustible repertoire, the repertoire of 1,000 lifetimes. If we did not, if we had the insignificant repertoire of a photodiode, maybe we would not see her, we would not even see the dark, perhaps we would see nothing at all. But Galileo's reflections had a short life. His hands were trembling, not of an old man's weariness, but of a child's thrill. They were holding the camera as they once held his first telescope. Alciuri had given him the digital camera, and he had learned to capture digitized images like an instant painter, to send them over waves in the air, to store millions of them on a pinhead, and to show each painting on a large beautiful frame where it was created anew. He could take pictures of anything, from a galaxy to a grain of sand. He could capture the effigy of all and everything, pictures of everything, of Pisa and Padua and Rome, of faces he knew and others he did not, and even of himself. He had not imagined any of this. How could he? He had not imagined one would go so far so fast, that men a few generations younger than himself would know so much, their powers so astounding. There is no imagining where science can lead, thought Galileo, and yet he had imagined that it would lead far away, and he had taken the first steps. They were small, but they were bold, he said to himself, and felt like a proud father who had not seen his child and decades later had found her a magnificent queen. But Alciuri was there to question, not to let him play. He had explained to Galileo how the camera worked. Its heart was a sensor that contained 1,000,000 photodiodes, arranged in a square grid just behind the lens. Like any other photodiode, the photodiodes on the camera sensor signaled light by an increase in current, each of them for a different element of the image. This was Alciuri's question. Was the camera conscious? Alciuri clearly had a point. To be conscious, Galileo had concluded, a system must be able to distinguish among a large repertoire of possible states. Then a photodiode, with a repertoire vanishingly small, just one state corresponding to dark and one corresponding to light, could only be minimally conscious, indeed just one bit conscious. Galileo knew exactly where Alciuri was leading him. If each photodiode could distinguish between just two possible states, corresponding to light or dark, an array of 1,000,000 photodiodes could distinguish among 2 to the power of 1,000,000 possible states. This was a number so large that it dwarfed the number of stars in the sky or that of grains of sand in the sea. The repertoire of the camera sensor would be worth 1,000,000 bits. "So is the camera conscious?" asked Alciuri. "No," said Galileo, showing no desire to say more. "But its repertoire of possible states, or shall we say possible images in this case, is at least as large as yours," insisted Alciuri. "Nobody has ever counted the number of possible experiences that are available to me," said Galileo. "Then you should examine this," responded Alciuri, and showed him a flickering screen of white and black dots. "What do you see?" "I see just a flickering mixture of white and black dots, like salt mixed with pepper," said Galileo. "In reality, You are seeing thousands of different pictures. Some dots that are white in one picture turn black in the next, and so on, said Alturi. But your brain cannot distinguish among them, and thus they all look the same to you. Yet to the camera, or to your retina, they are all different. Each one of them produces a different image on the sensor. So the repertoire of the camera may well be larger than that of your own consciousness. So it was, and so his thinking had been trivial, mused Galileo within himself. What he had concluded, that a large repertoire of distinguishable states is necessary for consciousness, that it made all the difference between himself and the photodiode, was a trivial fact. It was not even enough to make the difference between himself and the camera. So the size of the repertoire could not be the source of experience, and so information too, as S had said, juggling from his unicycle, had nothing to do with consciousness. Galileo tried to focus, but his mind was wandering. An aging man he was, toiling with new confusing instruments, but facing the same old problems.
Lose face? What shameful ignominy for the great Galileo! Screamed a short, crooked man, appearing from nowhere. First challenged by a photodiode, now fearful of a mere camera, said the man whose name was K. Fooled by his own perspective, Galileo himself believes the image on the camera is one. He thinks it's one. He does not see, the visionary physicist, the man armed with the telescope, that it is one only in the eye of the beholder.
K went on.
Here I am, facing the scientist who began the mathematical study of nature, who removes the mind of the observer from the description of the world of physics, and I wonder, how could such a scientist miss the obvious, the self-evident, that the observer must be removed once more? And I marvel, rather I lament, insisted K. Why is it always the same mistake? An error not of category, but worse still, an error of perspective? Yes, an error of perspective. Everyone makes the same mistake. People who should know better. I mean, they seem not to understand that epistemologically, what am I saying, ontologically, even deontologically, one might add, the only true perspective, the one and true perspective, is the intrinsic perspective, is it not? Galileo, he then said, the mind who first envisioned the relativity of motion, how could such a mind not see it? If one removes the observer who makes a unity of what is not, if one does that, the camera as an entity disappears, breaks down into its million constituting elements. For what exists wholly in and of itself, per se and in se, is not one entity with 2 to the power of 1 million possible states, but 1 million separate entities, each with just 2 states, such a simple truth, and yet even philosophers miss it. They seem to lack, so to speak, synthetic power. It even shows in their countenance. And K pointed to some portraits on the wall. Prompted by K, Galileo examined the portraits with a magnifying lens. Indeed, under the lens, each picture soon dissolved, each face disintegrated. 1 million little dots appeared. Each dot was what a photodiode knew of its subject. So now you see, said K. But not to worry. There are better philosophers than those. I'll put your memory and mine to the test. That being is. Indeed, it is the same to think and to be. Now that all has been named light and dark, everything is full at once of light and of dark night. The one, if it has being, is one and many. Having recited those lines, K showed Galileo a detail from a fresco by Raphael in Rome. It was the face of the only opponent whom Socrates had not trounced, the only one in all of Plato's dialogues.
Parmenides, exclaimed Galileo.
Quite right, said Kay. And what about this one?
I know this one too, said Galileo. It is Cardanus, who wrote a treatise on dice, perhaps the first that dealt with probabilities. Cardanus, who, he thought, had also been condemned a heretic, had been incarcerated, and finally had come to abjure his theories. But Cardanus had written another treatise, recalled Galileo, called De Uno, of the One. There Cardanus had said that what makes a man is not his parts, but rather their union.
One more,
said Kay, and Galileo saw a portrait of the Frenchman he had surprised asleep. He too, Galileo recollected, had said that consciousness is a unity, not made of parts that you cannot split in two as you can material things. And that's why body and soul are two different substances.
Excellent, said Kay, though I think I have said it best myself.
And he handed Galileo a hefty book, open on a page that began like this. The synthetic unity of consciousness is, therefore, an objective condition of all knowledge. It is not merely a condition that I myself require in knowing an object, but is a condition under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me. For otherwise, in the absence of this synthesis, the manifold would not be united in one consciousness. Although this proposition makes synthetic unity a condition of all thought, it is, as already stated, itself analytic. What did Kay mean? Galileo read further. The transcendental unity of apperception is that unity through which all the manifold given in an intuition is united in a concept of the object. The transcendental unity of apperception. What was Kay trying to say? Why was it so hard to fathom? Galileo turned, ready to ask, but Kay was gone. Galileo turned to Alciuri, who had been listening and seemed bemused. Kay might be right, said Galileo, but why should it be said so obscurely? Murky thoughts, like murky waters, can serve two purposes only: to hide what lies beneath, which is our ignorance, or to make the shallow seem deep. For once Alciuri nodded.
Kay is bad enough, but by no means the worst of them.
He laughed, and then he added,
Avoid philosophers. In the fog of thought, banality dresses like a mysterious mistress.
Perhaps, said Galileo, but so does truth itself. Notes. A long tradition, atomism, holds that everything can be explained by simple elements and their interactions. Is a picture just a collection of points? As Galileo realizes, that is exactly how a camera sees a picture, as a collection of points. But then, of course, it does not really see it. On the other hand, each photodiode in the camera sensor should see its point independently of the others. Otherwise, the camera would lose information about the picture. Among contemporaries, Semir Zeki thinks that individual pieces of the cerebral cortex generate individual pieces of consciousness, their own microconsciousness. Hieronymus Cardanus was a 16th century physician, philosopher, mathematician, and avid gambler who made the first attempt to develop probability theory. His was also the first study on dice rolling. Cardanus was jailed for heresy. He had cast the horoscope of Jesus Christ and managed to be released by recanting, which is probably why Galileo remembers him well. During the Renaissance, Cardanus with Delezio, Patrizzi, Bruno, and later Campanella was among the first to put forth a panpsychist view of the universe, or for Bruno, of infinite universes. Cardanos and Bruno especially emphasized unity as a property essential to mind or consciousness, and Bruno associated unity with monad.